warm welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. In this edition, we're going to discuss something that's increasingly being billed as the greatest show on earth, US President Donald Trump's visit to India starting this coming Monday. The reason is the optics. A given almost when you have two leaders like Trump and Modi. But what about substance? Will the visit yield anything of substance to India? That's what we're going to discuss with our panel of experts. Dr. Rajat Nag, former MD, Asian Development Bank, Saurav Chandra, former Secretary DIPP, as well as Commerce as well, and also T.S. Vishwanath, former colleague in the Economic Times, who as Principal Advisor at APG SLG Law Advisors, now advises government on trade and other policy issues. A small caveat, since this is a program that focuses on macroeconomic issues, we will look at the visit purely through the macroeconomic prism, omitting for the moment the geopolitical aspects of the relationship that are equally, if not very often, more important when you're talking with the global superpower. With that, let me welcome to the show Rajat, Saurav, Vishy. Perhaps the best description of Trump's trade policy, and I quote, is as a protracted campaign aimed at forcing other countries to submit to US demands. Under Trump and his trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, a well-known advocate of the America First trade policy supported by Trump as well, the US has increasingly opted for bilateral negotiations because smaller countries are much easier to bully one at a time rather than collectively. It has tried to do the same with India, but we've resisted so far. The much touted mini trade deal is now virtually off the table. The talk now is instead of trade facilitation. What does this mean for India? Let me start with you, Rajat.
Well, I think you have summarized it well, particularly in the context of this visit. Don't expect much, as you began the show by saying is the greatest show on earth. Any presidential visit has a lot of pomp and show. And certainly for this president, who revels in adulation and flattery, I think that's what it will be. My point about the trade essentially takes off from what you are saying. Over the last 3 years or so, actually, US has been tightening the screws. They imposed, first of all, the steel and aluminium tariffs. India was taken off the GSP list, which was worth, what $6 billion worth of duty-free goods entry into the US, Indian exports. Just a day after the visit was announced, the US trade representative took India off the countervailing duty measure list, which means India will now has been declared a developed country with $2,000 per capita, and we will be assessed on whether we should pay countervailing duties or not. So I don't expect the US to sort of be any soft on us. And equally, we have some major concerns. We have concerns about access to farms. Farmers will be affected. We have concerns about access to the retail industry that the US wants. We're concerned about the intellectual property rights that the US is insisting on. So I think at best some trade facilitation arrangements or whatever you might call it, but I don't expect much to come out of this trip. And I certainly don't expect much to come out really till the US elections are over, one way or another.
Saurabh, that's what Rajat said. We really didn't expect anything much, not out of this trip and not in the long term also, given our very diverse interests, especially because the US under Trump has not hesitated to bully its trading partners. And now Trump has said that we're saving the big deal for later. If we can't agree on a mini deal, what scope is there really for a big deal? And should we even think about it?
It's going to be difficult. Difficult because whatever he wants India to open up to would be very difficult to concede. Let's say the agri sector or the dairy sector. There's really no comparison. A US cow produces about 10,000 kg per year.
Sure.
And an Indian cow does about 1,700 kg per year. And the farmers are much, much bigger. They have much bigger herd sizes. So there's no comparison. Can we open up our dairy sector to them? Because it has to be seen in the light of doubling farmers' incomes.
Sure.
Dairy is an important component.
Yes, we'll come to the details about the sectors a little later. But for the moment, a mini trade deal, large trade deal, you don't think it's possible really with the US, not under the present dispensation?
Certainly not before the US elections.
Okay, and given that Trump is expected to come back, I'm not really sure what that really means. But Vishy, would you agree that it's virtually a no-no, both for a mini as well as a maxi trade deal?
I'm certainly, there was no trade deal. I think that's possible. What really we were talking about was what the US wanted from India. I don't think there was any discussion on what India wanted from the US.
So it was never a quid pro quo?
So it was never a quid pro quo. Only thing that we were talking about was some way reinstating the GSP. Which anyway was thrown away, as was just said a little while back, by the fact that we were taken out of the, we are now called a developed country by the US. So therefore even this whole thing of GSP coming back will have to be looked at very differently. So I don't think there was ever a trade deal or even a small trade deal on the table.
Rajat, Vishy talked about the GSP. In fact, that has been one of India's biggest grouses, is the fact that we've been taken off the GSP. And Trump's argument really is that we're now a developed nation. What are we talking about? A per capita income of 60,000 versus a per capita income of just about 2,000. So we've been trying to get ourselves back, but on the GSP list. But does it seem almost a done deal? It's impossible at the moment. You spoke about it also earlier, that the US now looks at it as a developed country. We're not. So what is your position on that, Rajat?
You know, it's a backhanded compliment to be declared a developed country, but I wish it were based on facts. And my view is that with this administration, in a way, facts don't matter. So I don't know how this will play out. I would be very surprised if the Trump administration now, or even if they come back, would exceed, because Mr. Trump has declared India a tariff king. Even though, you know, our trade deficit with the US is about 1/10 that of China. So for Mr. Trump, everything is transactional. And for him, the most important transaction now is obviously the elections in November. So he will milk this visit for all it's worth. And on the GSP, on the countervailing duty measures, quite frankly, I don't expect any significant concessions being made by the US to strike a deal.
Saurav, would you agree? Yes, Trump has always called India a tariff king. But the fact is that, as Rajat mentioned, our current account deficit is not remotely comparable, I mean, with the US trade deficit, is not remotely comparable with what it has with China. And it's been declining. So is the US position at all sustainable?
See, if he does concede anything, he'll ask for something in return. It's very simple. So what he'll ask in return, whether he'll be satisfied with that, is difficult to say. But at the moment, the eyes are on the election in November, and that's it.
In a way, it's good to think that India really counts for the US elections, but that maybe is a sign of that we have become somebody in the world. But Vishy, apart from trade, and you know, I'd like to get your views also on GSP, there are a number of other niggling issues with the US. There's data localization, e-commerce, IPR, the issue of visas. Which of these do you think is the most important? And let me start with e-commerce, because that's something the government really hasn't been able to frame a policy on. The argument that these big e-commerce giants, US-based, are increasingly going to work to the detriment of our small and medium enterprises. Is that a sustainable, correct argument? Where do you stand on this?
You know, I mean, I seriously think we need an e-commerce policy. We've been talking about it since February. We did come up with a draft policy, which was then not something which any of our trade partners liked. And since then, we have only been hearing announcements that the e-commerce policy is coming soon. But I think we have taken a couple of decisions where one is to ensure that, the Commerce Minister has been constantly talking about predatory pricing that the large e-commerce companies have been looking at. It is, it can certainly be argued that it is not predatory for the simple reason that they are not selling at a price which is lower than their cost price. And that's also the fact that it is not hurting any domestic industry per se. At least we don't see that happening.
But it does hurt the interests of the traders. At least their margins will get affected.
And I think that's why, I mean, I think the issues which we have with the US are very politically sensitive. So if you look at GSP, if you look at dairy, if you look at e-commerce, these are very politically sensitive issues on both sides. And I think that's the main reason why it's so difficult to have a deal with them. When we look at e-commerce, it is attached to that is the whole issue of data localization, which you talked about. When the first e-commerce policy, the draft e-commerce policy came out, it did talk about data localization and the fact that the data which is collected should get, also be shared with the smaller companies in India, which was vehemently opposed by some of the large players in the market. So the whole issue now is that to deal with the politically sensitive issues, and that's the reason I feel that it's getting pushed off beyond November, after when the next new president there comes. Hopefully, to be, I mean, one hears it'll be Trump again.
Yeah,
I don't know
that's
about
what I
hopefully, but at least we know that one is hearing Trump will come there. So if that happens, I think those politically sensitive issues can then get taken up and it can get discussed. Right now, one also reads about the fact that that different states of the US are now demanding that they should be able to sell more things into India. So the idea here is, what is it that we should really be looking at? I mean, if you look at any of those issues, data localization or e-commerce, there are two sides to the same discussion. It depends on which side you're on.
So
but I think both sides do have.
For the Confederation of Traders, which has been.
No, it is not that I don't have sympathy. It is just that they have one set of arguments.
Okay.
I think there is a set of arguments on the other side, and I think one needs to look at both sides of the argument before you start saying that one is right or the other is
and
wrong.
ultimately, everybody is looking at the domestic voter lobby, essentially.
Absolutely.
Both countries, really.
Absolutely.
But Rajat, the US faith in tariffs and quotas as a means of protecting American jobs is really a throwback to the days when trade barriers were the norm. And the argument that the US resorts to this only when foreign countries engage in unfair trading practices is a bit problematic, because what is unfair is always subjective. As Saurabh mentioned, US wants us to open up to imports of dairy products. But would you agree that given the kind of sensitivities that we have in agriculture, that is something that no Indian government can ever accede to? Rajat?
Ultimately, Mythili, as Saurabh said very rightly, these are domestic political imperatives and issues. And hopefully some give and take will happen or will have to happen. But I think we've got to recognize that Mr. Trump is making arguments for his domestic clientele, particularly in the Midwestern states, in which he's presenting India and China as sort of, people who are taking away their jobs, tariff kings, et cetera, et cetera. Fact is that the manufacturing jobs in the US have been lost over the last decade, not to the cheaper imports coming in, but really to robotics, the use of technology, and the loss of manufacturing jobs really has come from automation. But I don't think those deep issues are going to play very much on Mr. Trump's mind or maybe his domestic voters' mind. But maybe, Mythili, another point that if I could just move the conversation to another issue, which I think is important not only for the visit, but for the Indo-US strategic relationship, is really security. We've been talking a lot about trade, and obviously that's very important. But I think the Indo-US relationship really needs to think of the national, regional, global security, in which, of course, the US is very, very important. And India is playing an increasingly important role as well in the Indo-Pacific, in the Afghanistan, peace negotiations which are happening, in which Taliban will probably have a much greater say and influence. So I think we should probably think of these issues on a slightly broader mosaic.
Oh, absolutely, Rajat. I couldn't agree with you more, except that there are so many issues that we talk about Indo-US relations. So in order to narrow it and get a slightly more focused discussion, I thought we'd just look at the economics of the visit. I agree. Economics is always in a political context, so you're entirely right. But for this very, definite reason that we had to kind of make the discussion a little bit more focused, which is why I'm going to turn to you again, Saurabh, and ask you that, on the issue of e-commerce, which I had already asked Vishy, given the fact that the two largest e-commerce players in India are essentially US companies, and they have been giving pretty aggressive discounts on their online platforms, which is what the small and medium scale industry in India has been protesting about. What should our case be? How do we deal with that? Because the Competition Commission is looking to see whether it is anti-competitive behavior. So I'd like your views on that, number one. And number two, on Rajat's suggestion that the loss of jobs in manufacturing in the US is not because of cheap imports from China as much as because of robotics and artificial intelligence. So two questions for you.
E-commerce, it's very difficult to resist disruptive change.
Okay.
Technology will triumph. Whether we like it or we don't like it, there will be losers and there'll be gainers.
But when these losers translate into votes?
Even then, in the long run, technology will go ahead. We have policies. We don't allow FDI in the front end. So we have strange models which are then open for inquiry and investigation. FDI in multi-brand retail has been a non-starter, although it could have built the infrastructure. But Coming to the other question, could you please?
Yeah, the other question about, Rajat's point that the loss of jobs in manufacturing in the US is not because really of cheap imports from China, but more because of artificial intelligence, robotics, etc.
I think it's a mix of both.
Okay.
You have to be competitive. You need brick and mortar factories. Now, China can produce it at much cheaper prices for whatever reason. So that is there. But the future, and perhaps India and US should collaborate in artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning, automation, big data analytics. That is one area where we could think of collaborating with them.
Okay. There are many areas really with the US where we should and need to collaborate, but I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into a very short break. Please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing President Trump's visit to India, but from the relatively narrow focus, I agree, of the economics, the macroeconomics and the economic relationship between India and the US, to the extent that we can think of it as divorced from the politics. Which is one of the rationales really of, taxing digital economy is that, you need to tax companies depending on where they get their business from. And that's what the OECD and many other countries in the world have been arguing. We are yet to move on this, but the fact is that many of these companies, particularly US companies, are making big money out of their operations in India. How do we go about this?
I think we should just follow the global model. Okay. I mean, I think that would be that. It's absolutely fair to follow the global model and try and start putting whatever taxes that need to be put on digital economy. But the idea is, at the same time, the problem that we face is the moment we do that, are we restricting smaller players in our country from coming up and starting something? Because we also want to develop the entrepreneurial spirit, and we realize that can only be done through the digital economy. As Mr. Chandra very rightly pointed out, that the fact is that technology will drive, and the younger generation would like to use technology to build entrepreneurship. Now, if we go down the path, what's happening globally, will that really stop entrepreneurship, or will it actually something else that we need to do is something which is debatable and something which we should debate.
Except Rishi, many of these companies end up virtually not paying tax anywhere.
Absolutely.
So, given that they are generating this income from India, it's only legitimate that the government should tax.
Yes, they should.
But there will be enormous pressure not to tax.
And that's the reason why I think that we should follow the global model. And while yes, there is tremendous pressure not just here but globally also to stop taxing this, but I think we should certainly follow the global model and tax them.
Rajat, one more question to you on trade. What does the US's determination to engage only in bilateral deals really mean for the future of the WTO and its dispute settlement system? Because apart from trade, in fact, one of the biggest contributions of the WTO system has been in the intellectual property rights, where the right of countries like India to run with a differential system, especially in drugs and pharma, has been recognized by the WTO. And this also might get threatened, given that the US is constantly complaining about our IPR regime. How much legitimacy is there to this, Rajat?
Look, I think we just have to accept that with the present US administration's views on multilateralism, WTO is just as well dead. They have killed it almost by the back door, by not appointing, for example, the judges on the tribunal. I think there are probably none anymore, or probably just one. And so Mr. Trump doesn't have to close the shutters on WTO. He can just sort of close it through the back door. And I'm afraid they will continue this process of, as you said at the beginning of the show, on bilateral negotiations, because that's where they can bully the other side. And I don't see that change happening, at least for a while, because it is not just the present US administration. I think the US generally has been beneficiary, a tremendously, I would say, significant beneficiary of globalization when it suited them. And then when they saw the inevitable adjustments taking place of globalization, they started to pull inwards. And I hope very much that the rest of the world, India included, will not succumb to the protectionist tendencies, which I unfortunately see even happening in our own country. So I'm not optimistic on that, Mythili, but I hope very much, just as Saurav mentioned, technology will triumph. I would hope very much that good economics, which is also good politics, will triumph.
Well, yeah, that's been the dream of most economists, Saurav. But now let me just turn to the issue of FDI, foreign direct investment. You know, we had Jeff Bezos coming into India recently and announcing a $1 billion investment in India. And he said he's going to use it for digitizing small and medium businesses. And we saw the Commerce Minister saying, like, he's not doing us a big favor. Because the fact is that the US investment, bulk of it has really been not in greenfield investment, but in buying out Indian companies. Is one of the reasons the fact that we don't have a bilateral investment treaty? Is that the reason for the hesitation of large-scale US investment, particularly in greenfield projects?
See, there aren't too many greenfield projects coming up in any case.
Unfortunately, really.
And that leads us to a different subject altogether. Why isn't manufacturing ratio in the GDP going up? Now that's a separate topic for discussion. One could talk about it, but till manufacturing takes feet here, there will be a problem in greenfield. But US FDI, my guess is that a lot of it comes through the Mauritius and the Singapore route also. And maybe a lot of FPI is coming in. So it's a mix. Wherever they can make money, they'll come.
Okay.
So we finally come down to that. Brownfield is easier. Everything has been set up. The regulatory regime has been handled to a large extent. So they find it perhaps more worthwhile coming into the brownfield.
Okay. Vishy, one quick response to FDI, and also another issue that I wanted to ask you, which has always been a sticking point between India and US, is the issue of H-1B visas for working professionals. And is there a possibility that now with UK out of Brexit and the aggressive way they're trying to kind of, get talent from all other countries, we might now find the US a little bit more willing to talk to India and be a little bit more reasonable on H-1B visas? Any chance also of the totalization agreement? Because now that, there is competition for the US. Skilled workers can go as much to the US as to the UK. And the UK is aggressively wooing these people post-Brexit. So do you think we'll see any movement on that?
Frankly, I don't see the US getting influenced by anything that's happening anywhere else in the world. I think
it's
very insular. They just take decision based on what they think is right for them. But what I would think is that when we're talking about a much larger trade deal that Trump has been talking about for a while, I think would certainly have to include an H-1B visa, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense for India to have a trade deal with the US. So I'm sure that there would be a movement on totalization and as well as for H-1B visas if there is a trade deal between India and the US. Otherwise there is nothing else for it in India. On FDI, I think there is enough scope for a lot more FDI to come. But given the state of the economy today, I think we need to, I think wait for a little while before we really see the FDI and other things showing any kind of a positive sign of what it should be.
Rajat, another issue, in fact, that Vishy talked about is that the US has been pressurizing India to address the issue of data localization. And we have been resisting this, particularly in the area of financial transactions. I think there is some agreement now because MasterCard and Visa, the two largest credit card issuers, have been trying to now slowly, they're willing to fall in line with the RBI, only because RBI has been so firm. What is your view on data localization? Is it not a sovereign right of the country to insist that storage of such data be kept within our own shores? Or can we really, should we agree with the US position, US companies' position? Rajat?
Mythili, as you know, I am a avowed believer in globalization. So from that point of view, you'd expect me to say data localization should not be a major issue. But I fully agree with India's view and many other countries' views that data should be localized. It is a sovereignty issue. It is not an economic issue. It is, in fact, not even a political issue. I cannot have confidence that data, particularly financial data, particularly data which is sort of private, would be more secure elsewhere, which is what the US sort of says. Look, we have got all these banks of servers in the deserts of Mexico, or New Mexico, sorry. So no, I support the idea of data localization. Having said that, what I would also wonder if technology will essentially overtake that discussion, that it doesn't really matter where the data is localized, in which server where, that it will be accessed, easily accessed from anywhere else in the world. So that's something that I think we will have to think through. I think technology may trump us all, pardon the pun here on this, but I would otherwise strongly support the idea of data localization.
Except that, possession of data also gives you power. So we're running out of time. So very quickly, where do you stand on the position of data localization?
See, it's more about who has access to that data.
Sure.
And finally, technology would make it irrelevant where it is stored, but who has access. And perhaps from that point of view, storing it within the boundaries of the country is much better. Just one point, there should be a comprehensive economic agreement, which should include labor issues, which should include IP issues, which should include data localization besides trade and tariffs.
Okay. Vishy, very quickly, I think you had talked about data localization.
About data localization, I think when it comes to a security issue or a strategic issue, I think India is right in terms of seeking for data localization. But when you talk about data localization from a trade issue, which the draft e-commerce policy talked about, I think that requires a lot more discussion now.
Can we think in terms of a global agreement on data, because every country has this issue?
I think we should certainly look at it. While it will be a very, very difficult agreement to come up with, but I think it is given the fact that we now have this growing e-commerce and the growing use of technology across the globe, I think that would be a great idea.
I think that's really where India's advantage is. For us, multilateralism is much, much better than any kind of bilateral deal, particularly when you're talking about a country like the US and a president like Donald Trump. We've tried to make sense of the economic issues, but as I said, since everything in the economic sphere is determined particularly from geopolitical, strategic aspect also, there's very little that pure economics can really do to solve the issues between India and the US. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.